In my previous video, I reviewed The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Spiegel. And I ended that review by saying perhaps now that I've read the book, it's time for me to finally check out the movie. And here I am, I've checked out the movie, and this is my review. So a little bit of background here, and I'm going to repeat myself slightly from the previous video, but I'll try and keep it brief. The Last Unicorn was a book published in 1986. It was made into a movie in 1982, released by the Rankin-Bass Animation Company. It got a brief theatrical release, but apparently it did not do well. But it has since then attained a cult following from people of my generation and maybe a little bit younger who saw it on VHS. Despite having grown up in the 1980s, I somehow missed this movie entirely. I was never aware it existed until YouTube reviews came about in the late 2000s. But in my childhood, I had seen other Rankin-Bass fantasy movies. I saw The Hobbit by Rankin-Bass, the 1979 one. The Return of the King by Rankin-Bass, which I forget the year, but sometime in the early 80s. And Flight of the Dragons, also by Rankin-Bass, which came out in 1982. So those were three Rankin-Bass animated fantasy movies that I saw, at least in the case of The Hobbit and The Return of the King. I saw them multiple times as a child. I had them on VHS. And those three movies, Flight of the Dragons I only saw once as a kid, but it made an impression that one time I saw it. Those movies very much shaped my idea of the fantasy genre. I wish I would have read more widely in the fantasy genre when I was a kid, but I didn't. I guess like a lot of kids, I watched more cartoons than I read books, and those cartoons kind of formed in my mind what epic fantasy is. So when I became aware via YouTube reviews that there was another Rankin-Bass fantasy animated movie from the 1980s, I immediately had that urge of nostalgia that I should check it out. And I've taken my time. I mean, I've known that this movie has existed for at least about 15 years now. I think I saw I first became aware of it somewhere around 2008, watching reviews of it on YouTube. But part of me said, well, I should read the book first once I became aware it was based on a book. But now that I finally tracked down the book, I saw the movie. So even though this was my first time seeing this movie, the Rankin-Bass animated style was immediately familiar to me. Now this one, of the three I mentioned previously, Flight of the Dragons, The Hobbit, and Return of the King, those were all made for television or direct-to-video. The Last Unicorn was the only one of this group that actually got a theatrical release. And I think you can tell that the animation quality is higher. And I think the star power behind it is higher as well. They got a number of big name actors to voice the parts in it. Alan Arkin, Jeff Bridges, Mia Farrow, Christopher Lee, some other guys I'm probably forgetting. Angela Lansbury I think was in this as well. The production values, the talent involved, all that was higher. And yet, there are a number of qualities of it that, in my mind, certainly fit it very comfortably into the category of 1980s Rankin-Bass fantasy animated movie. The animation style, for one, I'll come back to that a little bit later maybe. The sound of the voices, and with apologies, I don't really know much about the technicalities of film production on this channel, so I'm always a little bit vague in my description. But there was something a little bit tinny and distant about the recordings, which to my ear reminded me very strongly of those other Rankin Bass fantasy movies. And just kind of some of the production quirks, the opening scene, which ended on a dramatic line and then a shot of the bird flying and the eagle calling out, and then the kind of cheesy folk music that came in with the title, that struck me as very reminiscent of the Rankin Bass animated films I had grown up with. And as perhaps may already be apparent by what I've said so far, I have a lot of nostalgia for this particular style, even though I recognize its faults. So even though the soundtrack to this movie was really awful, and the songs were boring, and by this really boring folk band called America, and they were kind of just shoehorned in at awkward places in the movie, even though part of me objectively recognized that as not good filmmaking, there was another part of me that just took comfort in seeing the style again. Like, this is exactly the kind of film I used to watch as a kid. That, you know, this reminds me perfectly of the Rankin Bass Hobbit adaptation, for example. So I did feel a wave of nostalgia watching this, even though this was my first time seeing this particular film, which is largely going to cause me to be forgiving of the film's faults. But there is a lot to praise about this film as well. So watching this film, the film is a very close adaptation of the book, which I guess is not surprising because Peter S. Beagle, who wrote the book, also wrote the screenplay. So he kept the same story as the book, and a lot of the dialogue is straight from the book. In an abbreviated form, you know, conversations that go like for 2 pages in the book get reduced to 2 lines in the movie, but that's what you do in a movie, right? You've got to cut the story down to its bare essentials. But even though the conversations are abbreviated, those quotations do, for the most part, come directly from the book. So as I was watching this, revisiting some of the scenes I recognized from the book, rehearing some of the dialogue that I recognized from the book, it occurred to me that perhaps in my review of The Last Unicorn, which I filmed a couple days ago, I didn't really do justice to this book. And that actually frequently happens to me when I film a review. Largely because I'm filming it unscripted and off the cuff. I tend to just kind of spout out whatever observations are just kind of in the forefront of my brain. And so I was thinking primarily of my experience reading the last 50 pages of the book, and had perhaps forgotten some of the earlier very well done scenes in the beginning of the book, and had forgotten perhaps some of the good lines from the beginning of the book. Not that I want to take back anything I said in my review of this book, but just that I wish I would have tempered it with maybe some more positives. While I'm on the subject, I've been watching a few YouTube reviews of the movie, just to kind of see what's out there. There are a lot of YouTubers who have reviewed this movie over the last 15 years. Much more so than have reviewed the book. So, you know, if you search for reviews of the book, you'll find like 3 reviews. If you search for reviews of the movie, you'll find like 50. But, you know, that's modern life, right? More people watch movies than read the books. So there are some interesting reviews of the book. There are some interesting reviews of the movie out there on YouTube, which are exploring themes which they're talking about the movie, but it could equally as well apply to the book. talking about how the unicorn represents loss of innocence. Now that's a fairly obvious theme. I picked that one out myself just from reading the book. I wasn't that impressed by that theme if you watched my review of this, but other people tend to have gotten more out of it, and perhaps there was more there than I gave it credit for. People talk about how the movie, and again, in turn, the book as well, deals with themes of recognizing your morality. And yeah, I can see that. There was one long review which talked about how this movie was dealing with the struggles of what it's like to be trapped in a woman's body. And perhaps the reviewer seemed to have made a very good case for it. Now, the thing is, it's a man who wrote the book, and it's a man who wrote the screenplay. So, how much do men know about what it's like to be trapped in a woman's body? I wouldn't credit myself with knowing that much, but maybe Peter S. Beagle is more insightful than I am. But anyways, point being, I guess, there are a lot of people who are reading this story. Again, they're primarily talking about the movie on a deeper level than I am. And, I guess I always have to give a caveat with this channel. I'm not that much of a deep thinker, especially on my first time through a book. Maybe my second or third time through, some of it might sink in a little bit more, but yeah. So take me with a grain of salt. There are people who appreciate the story a lot more. But anyways, the movie very closely based on the book, but a much more streamlined view of it. Now, in the past, I may have been tempted to say what readers often say. The book is better because the movie cut out so much. But I've been watching a lot of Steve Donahue over on BookTube recently. And if you watch Steve Donahue, you know one of his frequent themes is, despite being a voracious reader himself, he pushes back on this idea that the book is always better. He said the movie is almost always better because the adaptation has to cut out all the fat and just preserve what works from the original source material. So Steve has got me reevaluating what I would have just reflexively said before, the book is always better, and thinking, is the movie actually better? So, the movie does cut some stuff from the book. I think the most notable thing it cuts is the whole town of Hagsgate, which was a section in the middle of the book where this town in King Hagrid's kingdom was under this kind of weird curse. I'm not going to get into the whole thing. Just completely gone from the movie, and you really don't miss it. The story operates perfectly well without it. Now I don't want to say the book is weaker for having it in, because I thought those scenes were clever. I thought that there's a little, if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. There's an irony in the witch's curse that she puts on Hagsgate that I think works quite well in the book. But the movie doesn't have it. It works better without it. In my review of the book, I complained that the scenes in Hagrid's castles were too depressing and went on for too many pages. In the movie, all of that is much more streamlined. I mean, the castle is still a little bit gloomy and disturbing, but it's much shorter in the movie. So you don't have this sense in the movie that you do in the book. In the book, you have this sense that the plot is just stuck in Hagrid's castle, and it's not sure. You know, the characters went there to find out about the mystery of the missing unicorns and the lost bull, but then they just get stuck doing nothing for about 50 pages. I found it a little bit frustrating as a reader, just like, okay, come on, what are we doing here? Why are we hanging out in this gloomy castle doing nothing? But yeah, in the movie, again, all of that is much streamlined, so you don't get that sense of the plot just being stuck. And so the story moves better in the movie. The dramatic music in the final scene in the movie adds to it, even though the animators made the decision not to show any of the violence in the movie. It just kind of cuts away whenever there's a character who gets hit, which they wouldn't do in today's today, huh? But I guess that was what was seen appropriate for kids' films then. Yeah. So in some ways, the movie does work better than the book. There's one thing, and it's a small thing, but it's a thing I noticed, so it's a thing I'm going to talk about, is the butterfly. So in the book, the unicorn has left its magical forest and is walking through the lands of men. And the men don't recognize the unicorn. They see it, but they think it's just a horse. They can't see the horn. There's this thing going on in the book about how you have to really know it's a unicorn in order to see it. It's a little bit weird. But the unicorn is becoming a little bit depressed, and then it runs into a butterfly. And it's hoping to get information from the butterfly, but the butterfly only talks in songs, and it seems to have like the brain of a butterfly, just kind of fluttering around from one random thought to another. So the unicorn is convinced that she's not going to get anything useful from the butterfly, but then the butterfly reveals that it actually does recognize the unicorn. He sees her, he knows she's got a horn, he knows what she is, and the unicorn feels very happy to be recognized. In the movie, they move that scene with the butterfly back to when the unicorn is still in her magic forest, before the unicorn has had this crisis by not being recognized. So it doesn't make any sense the way the movie moved it around, because the unicorn is talking to the butterfly recognizes the unicorn is so happy to be recognized, but the movie hasn't set up that the unicorn has a problem being recognized. And the unicorn hasn't yet left its magic forest and journeyed into the land of men where it's not recognized. So that part I thought, okay, that's a misstep. And, I guess Peter S. Beagle was writing the screenplay, but he must have slipped up on that point. I don't know. I think the reason why they moved the butterfly scene to the beginning, to the part where the unicorn is still in the magic forest, is because they apparently thought it was necessary to give the unicorn more of a reason to leave the magic forest. So in the book, the unicorn overhears a conversation between two human hunters about how there are no other unicorns left in the world. And that causes the unicorn to leave her forest and go out on the journey. In the movie, the unicorn overhears this conversation, gets a little bit disturbed, but then says to herself, well, what do men know anyways? Which I guess when they were doing the screenplay for the movie, they must have said, this doesn't really work. That why would the unicorn trust the word of two hunters, right? She needs more of a reason to go out. So then we put in the part about the butterfly. Earlier in the movie, so that the unicorn now gets the information from the butterfly about the Red Bull. That information would have come later in the book, but now it's more up at the beginning of the movie to give the unicorn more of a reason to go out. So, okay, I get why they did it. They messed up a little bit on it. The other thing, in the book, it's very clear, made very clear by the narration, that the magician or the sorcerer Smedrick is only able to perform magic when he allows the magic to possess him. he can't really control it himself, but he can sometimes just give his body over to the magic. Then the magic will take possession of him and do something, and he's not even really in control of what the magic does. And that's important because there are a couple key plot points that hinge on that. For example, when the unicorn gets transformed into a woman. It was there in the movie. It was hinted at in the movie. I was a little bit worried it wasn't as clear as it could have been in the movie. So I thought, somebody who's only watching the movie and who's never read the book, is this going to be clear to them what's going on? Maybe. I don't know. I quite often, this is quite often the case with people who read the book first and then see the movie, right? You think, oh, the movie's not explaining it well. But maybe actually the movie is explaining it fine. And those of us who have read the book are just worried that it's not as obvious as it was in the book. Let me know if you saw the movie before reading the book, if you thought it was clear what was going on with Smedrick and his magic. Okay, so one of the oddities of this movie is, let me back up. The real oddity of this movie is why they chose to make it in the first place, right? So picture this. You're the Rankin Bass studio. You're making a fantasy movie. There are who knows how many thousands of great fantasy stories out there. Stories that have very recognizable hero's journey structures with a clear hero, clear bad guy, a clear plot and a climax, and just kind of, like the classic hero beats the dragon type story. There's a million very identifiably clear stories waiting to be adapted. Why in the world would you choose this one? This is such an odd story to make into a children's movie, an animated children's movie. And like I said, there to a certain extent, the movie does work better than the book, at least in terms of the pacing. But I was watching this and I thought, I could imagine being a kid in the 80s, being so confused by this. And if the internet is any indication, a lot of the reviews of it on YouTube are by people saying, yeah, I watched this as a kid, and it horrified me as a kid. That there are some scary scenes in this which are not, they're not scary from the adult's point of view. But people will say, yeah, this terrified me as a kid, and I can say, yeah, I can kind of see that, thinking how easily little kids get scared by this kind of stuff. The talking skeleton, the harpy getting out of her cage, the bright red bull, the creepy castle. There's a lot of stuff in there, and not to mention the very strange plot, which is maybe about the loss of innocence, or maybe about coming to terms with our mortality, maybe about what it's like to be trapped in a woman's body. It's just not whatever philosophical stuff it's getting at. It's not a great plot for kids, right? And I was thinking as I watched the movie, and I'll get into the animation style a little bit maybe later if I have time, but there are some scenes, particularly when they're going into the unicorn, at the beginning and the end, when we're in the unicorn's forest, there are some scenes where the nature is shown in very kind of block style with straight lines, which reminded me a little bit, just a little bit, of that same style which was used in certain points in Disney's 1956 Sleeping Beauty movie, which was also like a fantasy movie. I mean, I know it was more of a fairy tale, but if you remember the Disney 1956 Sleeping Beauty movie, it had elements of epic fantasy in it. The dark castle, the goblin creatures, the prince fighting the dragon, etc. And it made me think. Disney's Sleeping Beauty is a very easy to grasp movie for kids. I mean, it's just like a classic story. Perfect for kids. Doesn't confuse them at all. Maybe the dragon scene is a little bit scary, but it's just a very straightforward kid's story. So, in the 1950s, they knew how to make animated kid stories. And skipping after the 1980s, by the time we got to the 1990s, once again, they were making very straightforward kid stories. You know, the Disney Renaissance, The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, the Pixar. We're back to very kind of classic, straightforward kid stories that don't leave you scratching your head being like, what the hell was that? But there was this period in the 1980s, right? Where there were all these really dark, strange fantasy movies for kids. I mean, you know them as well as I do, right? The Rats of Nim, The Labyrinth, The Black Cauldron, the Dark Crystal, The Never-Ending Story. I'm not the first person to, the Return to Oz. I'm not the first person who has pointed this out. Lots of reviewers on YouTube have pointed out this weird thing going on in the 1980s. Which, I know I'm not the first person to ask this question, but what was going on in the 1980s? You knew how to make kids' fantasy before the 1980s. People knew how to make kids' fantasy after the 1980s. Why did things just get real dark for a period in the 1980s? And I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure you could make a whole video essay just discussing that. Something left over from the 1970s that was bubbling into the 1980s. One of the reviews I saw on Goodreads for The Last Unicorn, one of the negative reviews, said, this is just like a classic 70s weird story. Now, technically this was published in 1968, but maybe close enough. Maybe this was right on the cusp of being in the 70s. Maybe there's some weird things going on in 70s fantasy literature, which was influenced by the Vietnam War and counterculture. I don't know, which made it into the films of the 1980s. I'm sure there's, I don't know. I'm sure there's an interesting thesis to be dug out by somebody about why this was happening, but it was a thing, right? So, I guess file this under weird 1980s fantasy films, which just seem absurdly dark and strange to be aimed at kids today. I mean, the fact that it's dark isn't even the strangest part. It's just a really bizarre story, especially considering all the much more simpler, easy to do stories that you could have done about fantasy for kids. The animation style, one of my coworkers said to me, he said it's interesting mix of Japanese and Western style animation. He said it was during a period where the Japanese influence was being felt in American animation. And I kind of listened to him say this. He was saying this to me a couple days ago when I was reading the book before I saw the movie. And I thought, I hear what he's saying. It does look a little bit like Japanese-esque, but this is the Rankin Bass style. It's not a Japanese style. But then I was watching The Last Unicorn, and when the unicorn gets transformed into a woman, and she appears in a woman's body, you can't. That is just obviously Japanese. The Lady Athelia, the unicorn changed into a human. When you see that, it's. If you've seen any Japanese anime at all, and I lived in Japan for 8 years, you can say, okay, that animation style is distinctively Japanese. And sure enough, if you look this up on Wikipedia, the Rankin Bass Animation Company outsourced their animation to Japan. Not only The Last Unicorn, but it looks like all their animated films. And even if you don't look it up on Wikipedia, you can see Japanese animators being credited in the ending credits. I'm out of time. The camera I'm using has a 30-minute limit on the video